class, it's Miss Chaudhry. In our previous lesson, we went through how to use these 8 steps to accurately create a balanced ration for an animal that meets one of their nutrient needs. Today, you have 3 practice problems to work on. So I have my 3 practice problems on the board. I'm going to read them. And if you haven't already worked through them, I want you to pause the video and go ahead and solve them and then come back when you're done so that we can go through them together. So problem number 1 asks you to determine how much corn and cob meal and linseed meal are needed to create a 500-pound ration that contains 20% crude protein. Please note, corn and cob meal is 1 feedstuff. Question number 2, if I want to create a 950-pound ration with 14% crude protein, how much shell corn and wheat middlings will I use? And question 3, create a 100-pound ration of alfalfa hay and barley that has 1% calcium. So again, if you haven't done these problems yet, now is when you should pause the video and go ahead and work through them on your own. Just grab yourself a scratch sheet of paper and then come back when you're done. All right, so hopefully you've got those taken care of and you're ready to see how you did. Problem number 1, determine how much corn and cob meal and linseed meal are needed to create a 500-pound ration that contains 20% crude protein. For problem number 1, I'm really gonna go through it step by step, kind of talking through these steps again as we go, just to keep us in that idea, or using those steps to help us understand how to solve. So the first step then is I make my box. It's actually a pretty good box for Miss Chaudhry. We're going to put our desired amount of the nutrient, which in this case is 20% crude protein, in the center of that box. That's what I'm trying to balance to. Step number 2 says to select the feedstuffs we're going to be adding. In this case, we know we're going to use corn and cob meal, and I'm going to write C and CM. And then I also know we're going to use linseed meal, so an LM. And I need to figure out what their nutrient values are for protein, because that's what I'm feeding for. So I'm going to go ahead and go over to the Pearson Square, to the feed composition guide that we use for our Pearson Squares. And I'm going to find the right values. So first I have corn and cob meal. That is a concentrate. So I'm going to find that in the chart. And I'm going to go to the CP, or crude protein column, because that's the value that I need. That's the nutrient I'm feeding for. So it says that that is a 9%. I'm going to write my 9 up in that box. Okay. I'm going to go back to the chart because I still need my information for linseed meal. Linseed meal is actually a protein supplement. So I find that one, again, highlight through, and it's 39%. I'm going to write that in. Another reminder, when we're using feedstuffs, if we don't have one feedstuff whose nutrient value is higher and one that's lower than what our target is, it's not going to work. You can do the math, you can solve out and get an answer, but realistically, you're not going to get an accurate answer because you can't get in the middle of 2 numbers if they're not on either side of that middle target. All right, so that's my step number 2. Step number 3 is to cut my square. I'm adding in those arrows that are going to help guide my math in a little bit. Step 4 is to add labels to the right-hand side. So when I'm doing this, what I'm really solving for to start with is how many parts of each ingredient I will need. So my parts are going to go on the top parts, C and CM, corn and cob meal, and on the bottom parts, linseed meal. Remember that your labels are going to go straight across. Okay, that's important. As I said in our last video, it's the number 1 mistake that students make is flipping those labels or not flipping their math. Okay, which takes us to step number 5. Step number 5 says to subtract diagonally to get the number of parts of each feedstuff. So here I'm going to start with 9 minus 20, or you can do 20 minus 9. Either way, you're going to get 11. If you subtract 9 minus 20, it gives you a negative value. For this, you can just ignore the negative. Okay? That's not the important part, and we can't have a negative amount that we're adding to our recipe. Okay? Our next one, we have linseed meal at 39. 39 minus 20 is going to give me 19. So at this point, I have 19 parts of corn and cob meal and 11 parts of linseed meal. Step number 6 asks us to add the total parts of each feedstuff so that we know how many parts are in the entire ration or the entire recipe. So in this case, if I add 19 and 11, I get 30 total parts of what I'm making. Okay. Step number 7 asks us to divide the number of parts for each feedstuff by the total number of parts so that we can get our percent. In this case, it's asking us to solve for a weight. It's asking us how much. So we're going to just solve that part out. We're not going to do the multiplying by 100 because I don't want a percent value for this problem. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is kind of rewrite my labels so that I follow through on those labels. So I rewrote those. I'm dealing with corn and cob meal and linseed meal. So 19 divided by 30 is going to give me my percentage for corn and cob meal, which when I take out my trusty cell phone calculator, that's going to give me a value of about 0.633. As I said previously, I recommend going 3 places past the decimal point just to give yourself some more accurate information and more accurate numbers when you multiply by their weights. When I take linseed meal and I divide 11 by 30, that number is going to give me a 0.367. Okay, and there I did do a little bit of rounding. Reminder, there are a couple places along the way that you can kind of check and see if you've made a mistake. I didn't mention this one in the last video, but if you take these two numbers and add them up and they don't equal approximately 1, depending on your rounding, it could be a little over, a little under, but if they don't equal approximately 1, then you've made a mistake somewhere and you want to go back. Okay, so that was step number 7. I have the percents for each feedstuff. The next thing I need to do, which is the last thing I need to do, is to determine the overall weight of each feedstuff in the feed. I want to multiply its percent by the weight of the feed I'm trying to make. My problem told me that I needed 500 pounds. So for each of these values, these decimal values, I'm going to multiply by 500. And that is going to give me my answer. So when I do that and I multiply those out, I'm going to get about 316.5 pounds of corn and cob meal. Again, making sure you put in those labels is very important because the whole reason you're doing this is to make sure that your animal gets a properly rationed meal. And if you don't put those labels in and you flip them, you've completely changed how much of that nutrient that animal is trying to get. Worst case scenario, you could cause either what's called a toxicity or a deficiency, where that animal is either getting too much or not enough. And over time, toxicities and deficiencies can both be fatal for animals. It can make them very sick, affect their productivity, affect their work, and ultimately could cause them to die of what we call malnutrition or poor nutrition. And so you want to include those labels. If I solve out my last number, my linseed meal, I'm going to get 183.5 pounds of LM or linseed meal. So that's our answer to the first problem. Okay, I'm going to solve the last two a little bit less step by step. I'm just going to kind of work through them without talking about each step now that we've practiced a little bit more. For number 2, I'm creating a 950-pound ration with 14% crude protein using shell corn and wheat middlings. If I start going through and solving, put my 14 in the box. Got shell corn, which when I looked at the feed chart was 9% protein. Wheat middlings was 19%. Okay, I go in, I'm putting in my arrows. Okay, then I'm going to move my labels over. So I'm going to have parts shell corn. I'm going to have parts wheat middlings. Then I'm going to do my subtraction. 9 minus 14 gives me 5. 19 minus 14 also gives me 5. I add those together. I'm going to have 10 total parts in my recipe. I want to know how much I have of each ingredient, so I'm going to take that 5 parts of shell corn, divide by 10. That's going to give me 0.5. I'm going to do the same thing for wheat middlings. 5 divided by 10 is going to give me 0.5. I take each of these values, I multiply them by 950 pounds. It's kind of convenient because these are the same number, which means I'm going to get the same answer. So for both of those, it's going to end up being 475 pounds of that individual nutrient. So in this case, shell corn, and in this case, the wheat middlings. So for number 2, you should have gotten 475 pounds for each. Again, I went through that kind of quickly, but I'm following each of those steps as I work my way through. I want to go to my last problem, which is going to be a little bit different because this problem is using calcium, and our last couple problems we've used strictly protein. This process works the same no matter which nutrient you're feeding for. Our chart doesn't contain the values of every single nutrient. We just picked a couple to give us that information to allow us to practice utilizing this procedure. Okay, but obviously any nutrient that you want to look at, carbohydrate value, selenium value, sodium, anything could be done using this exact same procedure. Question number 3 says to create a 100-pound ration of alfalfa hay and barley that has 1% calcium. So I'll make my box, 1%. I'm going to put that CA on the bottom just to help remind me, especially now because I've been doing protein. Okay, I want to put my labels, alfalfa hay and barley. If I look on the chart, my alfalfa hay value is 0.94% calcium, and my barley is 0.06%. They're small numbers, but, oh, Miss Shadry made a mistake. I'm going to go back for a second, and I read on the wrong side of the square. It's not 0.94, it's 1.4. This is a good reminder that when you're not following the steps closely, that's when it gets easy to make a mistake, especially if, like me, you're trying to work through kind of quickly. My apologies. But again, good reminder, even those of us who've done this literally dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds of times by now, even I make a mistake if I'm not thinking about what I should do. So my alfalfa hay is 1.4% calcium. My barley is 0.06. Again, I noticed that 1 is above this target number and 1 is below, which means that I know this problem is going to work correctly. I just have to go through and solve it. Not really any different, we're just working with smaller numbers. So I've got my information in. I'm going to put in my cut arrows to help remind me to guide my math. I'm also going to go ahead and put in my labels. So on the top, I've got parts alfalfa hay. On the bottom, I have parts barley. I'm going to go through, and now I'm going to subtract. So 1.4 minus 1, as I move my math diagonally, is going to give me 0.4 parts for barley. 0.06 minus 1, or again, you can do that in reverse and not worry about the negative. 1 minus 0.06 is going to give me that that I tried to use earlier. Okay. Next thing I want to do is add these numbers up. So when I add 0.4 plus 0.94, what I end up with is 1.34 total parts. And then I'm going to go ahead and use those to keep solving. So my next step is to divide each of my individual parts by the total. So I'm going to divide each one of these by 1.34 to get my decimal value. When I divide 0.94 by 1.34, I get 0.701 when I rounded. And for my 0.4 divided by 1.34, I got 0.299. Again, if I was worried, I could quick check this by adding these two numbers up. I know by looking at them, they're going to add up to 1, and that's what I want. Okay, my last step then, I need to multiply these by the desired weight, aka how much am I trying to create, which in this case is 100 pounds. So I'm going to multiply these by 100. If I multiply 0.701, I'm going to get 70.1 pounds. If you didn't know, before this was a hashtag sign, this was a representative for the pound key, so we use it to represent pounds sometimes. You can also put LBS, or you can write out pounds. I have no preference, just use one of them because you want to make sure that you're specifying your units. And then you also want to label those units as being alfalfa hay. Okay. And then my other one, my barley, my 0.299 times 100 is going to give me 29.9 pounds, LBSs, pounds, what have you, of barley. And I'm actually going to write that out because it's one letter. Okay. So those are your 3 practice problems for today. If you have questions, if you're not sure what you did wrong, number 1, feel free to go back and rewatch this video, rewatch the previous video that goes through the steps. If you're really struggling, you can email me. Please feel free to take a picture of your work and send it to me in an email. That way I can look at it and I can help give you some more specific feedback. And we'll check in with our next lesson. Take care, guys. Wash your hands, be safe, and I will see you tomorrow.